I'm Aubrey Mitchell, 29, a nurse who works double shifts to make ends meet. Standing in my grandfather Harold's marble-floored mansion for his 80th birthday, I felt out of place among designer outfits. My estranged father Richard hovered nearby with Cynthia, his trophy wife. When Grandpa Harold raised his glass and asked loudly, "Aubrey, how have you been spending your trust fund? The $3.4 million must be quite useful," I nearly choked. His smile faded as he registered my confusion. "You've never received any payments. Your father has been the trustee since you turned 18. Before I continue this shocking story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe to hear more family betrayal stories that prove truth is stranger than fiction. Now, let's dive into how my entire life changed in that single moment. My grandfather's study had always intimidated me as a child. Dark mahogany bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, certificates of achievement, and family photos dating back generations. Now at 29, I sat in one of the wingback chairs, feeling like that small child again, as Grandpa Harold shuffled through his safe behind a painting of our family estate. "I can't believe this," he muttered, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled out a thick manila folder. "The trust was established when you were 8, Aubrey, after your mother passed away." The mention of my mother sent a familiar ache through my chest. She died in a car accident when I was young, leaving me with a father who quickly remarried and seemed to forget he had a daughter. Grandpa Harold laid documents on his antique desk, pointing to signatures and dates. $3.4 million. "I set it up to ensure you would always be taken care of. Richard was appointed trustee until you turned 30, but you were supposed to receive quarterly payments starting on your 18th birthday." I stared at the papers, seeing my father's signature on withdrawal forms dating back 11 years. Quarterly withdrawals, large lump sums occasionally marked as educational expenses or property investment. "I don't understand," I whispered, my fingers hovering over the documents as if they might burn me. "I worked 3 jobs to put myself through nursing school. I have student loans. My car breaks down every other month." My tiny apartment flashed through my mind. The water stain on the ceiling that the landlord never fixed, the secondhand furniture I'd been so proud to purchase, the careful budgeting I did every month to make sure I could afford groceries and gas. "Where did it all go?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Grandpa picked up his phone, his face grim. "Jason, I need you at the house immediately. It's about Aubrey's trust." He hung up without waiting for a response. "Jason Holt has been our family attorney for 30 years, he explained. "He helped set up the trust. He'll know what to do." I sat in stunned silence, memories flooding back. The night I'd sat at my kitchen table crying because I couldn't afford both textbooks and rent that month. The time I'd developed an infection because I couldn't take time off work to see a doctor. The credit card debt I'd accumulated during nursing school that I was still paying off. "Where's Dad?" I finally asked. "He conveniently stepped out when I mentioned wanting to speak with you privately," Grandpa said, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. "Cynthia said he needed to make some calls." When Jason arrived 30 minutes later, his grave expression confirmed my worst fears. The trust was real. The money had been mine, and it appeared my father had systematically stolen every penny of my inheritance while watching me struggle. "Your father had a fiduciary responsibility," Jason explained, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the documents. "As trustee, he was legally obligated to manage these funds in your best interest." "Can we recover any of it?" Grandpa asked, his hand resting protectively on my shoulder. Jason sighed. "We'll need to conduct a complete forensic accounting. But yes, there are legal avenues we can pursue." My phone buzzed with a text from the hospital asking if I could cover another night shift. The irony wasn't lost on me, working extra hours to pay bills while sitting in a room discussing millions that should have been mine. "I want a family meeting," Grandpa declared, standing up with effort. I noticed for the first time how his hands trembled slightly. "Everyone needs to hear this." "Harold, your heart," Jason cautioned. "Remember what Dr. Wilson said about stress." Grandpa waved him off. "Some things are more important than my ticker. My granddaughter has been robbed, and it happened right under my nose. As we headed toward the door, I paused at a family photo on the bookshelf. My 8th birthday shortly after Mom died. Dad stood behind me, his hand on my shoulder, smiling at the camera while I blew out candles. The same year the trust had been established. I never understood why he became so distant after Mom died, I said quietly. I thought he blamed me somehow. Grandpa's face softened with sadness. No, Aubrey. I think Richard started seeing dollar signs instead of his daughter. And that's unforgivable. The grand living room of my grandfather's estate had hosted countless Mitchell family gatherings over the decades. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over antique furniture and Persian rugs. Family portraits dating back generations lined the walls, stern faces seeming to watch the drama unfold below them. Everyone had gathered as requested Aunt Patricia, with her perfect posture and perpetual look of concern. Uncle Robert, fidgeting with his wedding ring as he always did when nervous. My cousin Stephanie, who kept shooting me supportive glances from across the room. Grandfather's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Jenkins, hovered near the doorway, pretending to dust, but clearly interested in the unfolding drama. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy, like the humidity before a thunderstorm. I sat next to Grandfather on the antique love seat, the documents from his study spread on the coffee table before us. "Where's Richard?" Grandfather asked, his voice commanding, despite his age. "He and Cynthia went outside for some air," Aunt Patricia replied, glancing nervously at the French doors leading to the garden. As if summoned by his name, my father appeared in the doorway, Cynthia clinging to his arm. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she adjusted her designer dress. I noticed for the first time how expensive everything about them was. His tailored suit, her Louboutin, heels, the Rolex on his wrist. All potentially paid for with my money. "What's this emergency meeting about, Dad?" Richard asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Cynthia and I have dinner reservations at 7. "Sit down," Richard, Grandfather said, gesturing to the empty chairs across from us. "We need to discuss Aubrey's trust fund." My father's face remained impassive, but I noticed a slight twitch in his left eye. The same tell he'd had when lying about working late during my childhood. "What about it?" he asked, remaining standing. Grandfather held up the folder. 11 years of withdrawals. Over $3 million. Money that was meant for Aubrey's education, her first home, her future. His voice grew harder with each word. Money she never received. The room fell silent. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking each excruciating second. "I've been managing those investments for Aubrey's future," my father finally said, his tone dismissive. "The market has been volatile. There have been necessary expenses." "What expenses?" I asked, finding my voice. "I worked night shifts to pay for nursing textbooks. I live in an apartment with mold in the bathroom because it's all I can afford. Where did my money go, Dad?" Cynthia shifted uncomfortably, her hand unconsciously touching her diamond necklace. Another piece of jewelry that might have been purchased with my inheritance. "You've always been financially irresponsible, Aubrey," my father said, his voice taking on a condescending tone I remembered all too well from childhood. "You would have blown through that money in a year without proper guidance." "She never had the chance to be irresponsible with it," Stephanie interjected, standing up from her chair. "You never gave her access to a penny." Uncle Robert cleared his throat. "Richard, if this is true, it's very serious, legally and morally." "Oh, spare me the ethics lecture, Robert," my father snapped, "as if your business dealings would hold up under scrutiny." Uncle Robert fell silent immediately, his face paling slightly. "The money is gone anyway," my father continued, waving his hand dismissively. "Most of it went into business investments that didn't pan out." "You mean like that yacht you bought last year?" Aunt Patricia asked pointedly. "Or Cynthia's collection of designer handbags?" "How dare you?" Cynthia gasped, clutching her purse tighter. "I want a full accounting of every dollar," Richard, Grandfather said, his voice deadly calm. "And I want it by the end of the week." My father laughed, actually laughed. "Or what, Dad, you'll cut me off. Too late for that. Besides, you're not exactly in a position to make demands anymore." "What does that mean?" I asked, feeling a chill despite the warm room. It means your grandfather is an old man with a bad heart who should be careful about getting too worked up, my father said coldly. And it means this conversation is over. He turned to leave Cynthia, still clutching his arm like a life preserver. If you walk out that door, don't bother coming back, grandfather called after him, struggling to his feet. I mean it, Richard. This is your one chance to make this right. My father paused at the threshold, turning slightly. For a brief moment, I thought I saw regret flash across his face. Then his expression hardened. You've always favored Aubrey's mother even after she was gone. Now you're choosing her daughter over your own son. That's your choice, not mine. Richard, please, Aunt Patricia began, but he cut her off with a gesture. We're done here. Come on, Cynthia. As they stormed out, Grandfather suddenly gasped, clutching his chest. His face had turned ashen, and he swayed on his feet. Grandpa, I cried, catching him as he slumped forward. Call an ambulance, Stephanie shouted, rushing to our side. As I lowered Grandfather to the sofa, my nursing training kicking in automatically, I heard the distinctive roar of my father's Porsche starting outside, then speeding away down the long driveway. He hadn't even stayed to see if his father was all right. The hospital waiting room smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. I'd spent countless hours in places like this as a nurse, but sitting on the other side, as family, felt entirely different. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast everyone in a sickly pallor, highlighting the worry lines on Aunt Patricia's face as she paced the floor. The doctor said it was a mild cardiac event, I explained, having spoken with Grandfather's cardiologist moments earlier. They're keeping him overnight for observation, but he's stable. Thank goodness, Stephanie said, handing me a cup of vending machine coffee. At 27, my cousin was 2 years younger than me, but she'd always seemed more sophisticated with her finance degree and confident demeanor. Any word from Uncle Richard? I shook my head. I left 3 messages. Nothing. Figures, Stephanie muttered. He's probably hiding out at their lake house, trying to move assets around before we can track them. Jason Holt, the family attorney, arrived shortly after midnight, looking surprisingly alert despite the hour. He carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression of grim determination. How's Harold? He asked as he took a seat beside me. Resting. The doctor says he'll be okay if he takes it easy. Jason nodded, opening his briefcase. I've made some calls. We have options, but I won't sugarcoat it. Recovering misappropriated trust funds can be challenging, especially when it's been happening for years. Do we need to involve the police? Aunt Patricia asked, finally sitting down. Potentially. This could involve both civil and criminal proceedings, Jason explained. But first, I'd like to bring in a forensic accountant I know. Sarah Delgado is the best in the business at tracking money trails. 2 days later, I sat in a conference room at Jason's law office, staring at spreadsheets and bank statements that Sarah had already managed to obtain. The story they told made me feel physically ill. Your father began small, Sarah explained, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as she pointed to transactions on her laptop screen. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. Always with plausible descriptions like educational fund or investment opportunity. But by 2015, he was withdrawing 6-figure sums regularly. Where did it all go? I asked. Sarah clicked to another screen. Multiple destinations. A significant amount went into his import-export business. Luxury purchases, there's a paper trail for jewelry cars, the down payment on their beach house in Florida, and quite a bit moved offshore to accounts in the Cayman Islands. Can we get it back? This was the question that mattered most to me. Sarah and Jason exchanged glances. Some of it, potentially, Jason said carefully. Anything we can prove was directly misappropriated. But funds that have been spent or hidden well, he trailed off. I want to help, Stephanie said, sitting forward. I work in corporate finance. I know how to follow money. I looked at my cousin with surprise and gratitude. We'd always been friendly, but never particularly close. Why would you want to get involved in this mess? I asked. Stephanie's expression hardened. Because what Uncle Richard did is despicable, and because... She hesitated. Because Your mom was always kind to me when my parents were going through their divorce. She'd want someone looking out for you now. That evening, I returned to the hospital to find grandfather looking better, some color returned to his face. He was sitting up in bed arguing with a nurse about the blandness of hospital food. "There you are," he said when he spotted me, immediately dismissing his complaints. "Come sit. We need to talk." He reached for my hand once I was seated beside his bed. "Jason called me. He says we have a fight ahead of us." I nodded. "It won't be easy to recover the money." "Forget the money," grandfather said, surprising me. "I mean the fight against Richard. He's already been calling family members, telling them I'm senile, and you're manipulating me to get your hands on my estate." What I gasped. "That's ridiculous." "Of course it is. But Richard has always been persuasive. He's painting himself as the victim, claiming you never needed the trust fund because you were so independent." Grandfather's expression darkened. "He's trying to rewrite history." A nurse entered with medication, and I automatically assessed her technique, an occupational habit. After she left, grandfather continued. "I'm giving you access to family resources, Aubrey. The guest house at the estate is yours for as long as you need it, and I'm setting up a fund for legal expenses." "I can't accept," I began. "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "This isn't charity. It's righting a wrong that happened partly because I wasn't paying enough attention." Later that week, Stephanie and I met with Sarah again, this time in grandfather's study after he'd been released from the hospital. The forensic accountant had uncovered more troubling information. "Your father hasn't just taken from your trust," Sarah explained, showing us documents. "He's borrowed against family properties, including this estate, using fake authorizations." "That's impossible," I said. "Grandpa would never authorize that." "He didn't," Sarah confirmed. "The signatures were forged. And I found something else interesting. Most of the electronic documentation was modified by someone named Tyler. Is that name familiar?" I nodded slowly. "Tyler is Cynthia's son from her previous marriage. He's some kind of computer expert. Dad brought him into the family business about 3 years ago." As I drove to the guest house that evening, my few belongings already moved in from my apartment, I noticed a sleek black car I didn't recognize parked near the gates. It pulled away as I approached, but not before I caught a glimpse of the driver, Tyler. The implications were clear. They were watching the estate. Watching me. The battle lines had been drawn, and it was becoming increasingly clear that my father wouldn't give up without a fight. What I didn't know yet was just how dirty that fight would become. Morning sunlight filtered through the guest house windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. I'd been up since dawn, spreading documents across the antique dining table. Stephanie sat across from me, her laptop, open hair pulled into a messy bun as she squinted at financial records. "Look at this," she said, turning her screen toward me. "Your father's business partner, Derek Coleman, has been involved in 3 separate lawsuits alleging financial mismanagement. All settled out of court with NDAs. Derek," I murmured the name, conjuring vague memories. "Tall guy always laughing too loud at his own jokes. I met him at a company Christmas party years ago." "That's him. And get this. His previous business went bankrupt under suspicious circumstances with investors claiming missing funds." I rubbed my temples, fighting a headache. "So Dad didn't just steal from me. It's a pattern." The doorbell interrupted our research. Uncle Robert stood on the porch, shifting uncomfortably, his normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. "Can we talk?" he asked, glancing nervously over his shoulder at the main house. I invited him in, noting the dark circles under his eyes and his rumpled shirt. "Richard called me yesterday," he began, without preamble, declining my offer of coffee. "He's saying some pretty outlandish things about you and your grandfather. Let me guess. I'm a greedy, ungrateful daughter, and Grandpa is losing his mental faculties." Uncle Robert had the decency to look embarrassed. "Something like that. But that's not why I'm here." He hesitated, then continued. "Richard owes me money, too. A lot of money." What Stephanie and I exclaimed simultaneously. "He convinced me to invest in a development project in Arizona 3 years ago. $2 million. Nearly everything I had outside my retirement accounts. Uncle Robert's voice was bitter. The project supposedly failed, but now I'm wondering if it ever existed. This revelation shifted something in my understanding. Richard wasn't just stealing from a trust fund, he was systematically bleeding the family dry. As Uncle Robert left promising to send his investment documents to Sarah, my phone rang. Cynthia's name flashed on the screen. Should I answer it? I asked Stephanie. Absolutely. Put it on speaker. Cynthia's voice came through syrupy sweet at first. Aubrey, darling, this family situation is getting out of hand. Surely we can resolve this privately. I'm listening, I replied neutrally. Your father made some mistakes, yes, but pursuing this legally will only hurt everyone. Perhaps we could arrange a partial repayment. When I didn't immediately agree, her tone changed dramatically. If you continue with this vindictive witch hunt, you'll regret it, she hissed. We know people, important people. Your nursing career could be over with one phone call about substance abuse or patient mistreatment. I ended the call, hands shaking with anger. Did she just threaten you? Stephanie asked, wide-eyed. Apparently subtle isn't in Cynthia's vocabulary, I replied. Later that afternoon, grandfather's security guard found an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of my car. Inside was a typed note. Drop the investigation or your grandfather's health might take a turn for the worse. Some things are worse than stolen money. The security footage revealed Tyler Hoodie pulled up despite the warm weather leaving the note. The family battle was escalating dangerously. Sarah arrived the next day with more disturbing findings. Your father has at least 7 shell companies that I've identified so far. Money moves between them in a complex shell game designed to obscure the paper trail. Can you follow it? I asked. With time. But there's something else you should know. Sarah looked troubled. Based on the financial patterns I'm seeing, your father is nearly broke. What? How is that possible? Millions of dollars. Lavish lifestyle, failed business ventures. And she hesitated. And what? Evidence of significant gambling debts. High-stakes poker mainly. That evening, returning to the guest house after checking on grandfather, I found my door ajar. Someone had broken in. My laptop was missing, along with the file of original trust documents I'd been keeping. A framed photo of my mother had been smashed on the floor glass shards scattered across the hardwood. As I called the police, a text arrived from an unknown number. Back off. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A middle-aged woman introduced herself as Julia Winters, former accountant at one of my father's companies. I saw the legal notice in the business journal about the Mitchell trust investigation, she explained, perched nervously on the edge of a chair in grandfather's study. This isn't the first time Richard has done this. What do you mean? 3 years ago, he managed a trust for his business partner's daughter. Similar situation. He was the trustee until she turned 30. Somehow, when she came to collect, there was nothing left. Derek helped him cover it up. This new information sent me searching for more of Richard's potential victims. Within days, 3 more people contacted our legal team with similar stories. Stephanie's investigation into Cynthia revealed another disturbing pattern. She had been married twice before Richard, both times, to wealthy men who mysteriously lost their fortunes during the relationships. She's a gold digger with a system, Stephanie concluded. And I'd bet anything she introduced Richard to her son Tyler specifically to help with their schemes. Just as we were making progress, my father launched his countermove. Legal papers arrived. Richard was suing me for defamation and elder abuse, claiming I was manipulating grandfather for financial gain. It's a desperate move, Jason assured us. But it will slow things down, which is exactly what Richard wants. That night, I stood at the guest house window watching lights burn in the main house where grandfather was meeting with his doctors. The family estate, once a symbol of security, now felt like a battlefield. And despite our investigation, I couldn't shake the feeling that my father remained one step ahead of us. What I didn't yet realize was that the betrayal ran deeper than I could have imagined, and that one of our supposed allies was feeding information directly to the enemy. Rain lashed against the windows of the main house, matching the stormy atmosphere inside. The grand dining room, with its massive mahogany table that had hosted countless Mitchell family holidays, now served as the setting for a strategy meeting that was anything but festive. Jason Holt sat at one end, legal documents spread before him. Sarah Delgado had her laptop open, spreadsheets illuminating her focused face. Aunt Patricia nervously twisted her pearls while Stephanie typed notes on her tablet. Grandfather sat at the head of the table, looking more frail than I cared to admit, but his eyes remained sharp and determined. The lawsuit is a delay tactic, Jason explained, but we still need to respond. I've prepared a countersuit alleging breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and embezzlement. When do we involve the police? I asked the question that had been weighing on me for weeks. We have enough evidence now to file a criminal complaint, Jason confirmed. But once we do, this becomes public record. The family name will be in headlines. Grandfather waved his hand dismissively. The Mitchell name means nothing if it doesn't stand for integrity. File the complaint. Uncle Robert, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. I think we're moving too quickly. All eyes turned to him. Richard is still family. Perhaps there's a way to handle this privately, give him a chance to make amends. I stared at him incredulously. Make amends. He stole over $3 million from me, forged documents, threatened Grandpa's health, and is now suing me for elder abuse. What exactly would making amends look like? Robert shifted uncomfortably. I'm just saying we should consider all options before going nuclear. Family is family. Robert's right, came a voice from the doorway. We all turned to see Aunt Patricia's husband, Calvin, who rarely involved himself in family matters. Richard reached out to me yesterday. He's willing to negotiate. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows. When exactly did Richard contact you? Calvin grandfather asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Calvin faltered under his direct gaze. A few days ago. He seemed genuinely remorseful. Interesting, Sarah said, looking up from her computer. Because I just discovered a wire transfer from one of Richard's shell companies to an account belonging to Baxter Holdings. She turned to Calvin. You're the primary shareholder of Baxter Holdings, aren't you, Mr. Pearson? The room erupted in chaos. Aunt Patricia gasped, staring at her husband in disbelief. Stephanie jumped to her feet, accusations flying. Jason attempted to restore order while Grandfather simply watched, a profound sadness etching deeper lines in his already weathered face. When the commotion subsided, Calvin was gone, and Uncle Robert looked like he wanted to disappear as well. Robert Grandfather said quietly, Is there something else you need to tell us? Under the collective stare of the family, Robert crumbled. I owe money to some people. Serious people. Gambling debts. Richard promised he could help if I kept him informed about our strategy. The betrayal stung like a physical blow. Robert had been at every meeting, had seen every document, knew every move we planned to make. Get out, Grandfather, said his voice barely above a whisper. Both of you out of my house. As Aunt Patricia followed her husband and brother out, sobbing apologies, I felt the weight of family secrets crushing down. Who else couldn't be trusted? How deep did this web of deception go? Grandfather's health deteriorated visibly over the next few days. His doctor increased his medications and ordered complete rest, but stress was taking its toll. I moved from the guest house into a bedroom near his suite, my nursing training suddenly all too relevant as I monitored his condition. I've failed this family, he confessed one evening as I checked his blood pressure. I was so busy building the Mitchell empire that I didn't notice it rotting from within. This isn't your fault, I insisted, though my own faith and family had been shattered. A week after the confrontation, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. Aubrey Mitchell, a woman's voice asked. You don't know me. My name is Diana Mitchell. Mitchell, I repeated, confused. Your father's sister. The family doesn't speak of me much, I imagine. I vaguely recalled hearing about an aunt who had caused problems and left the family years before I was born. No one ever explained what had happened. We met at a cafe 30 miles from the estate, away from prying eyes. Diana Mitchell was in her 60s, elegantly dressed, but without the ostentation that characterized much of the family. Her eyes, the same Mitchell blue as grandfather's and mine, held a weariness that spoke of old wounds. I left when Richard was just starting in the family business, she explained, stirring her tea. I caught him manipulating the books, confronted him, and suddenly found myself painted as an unstable, jealous sister, trying to undermine the golden boy. Eventually, it was easier to walk away. Why are you coming forward now, I asked. Because history is repeating itself, and because Harold is getting older. Some truths shouldn't die with him. She reached into her purse and withdrew a thumb drive. This contains financial records from 25 years ago. The beginning of Richard's schemes. It won't help you recover your trust, but it establishes a pattern of behavior that might strengthen your case. As I drove back to the estate, my mind raced with new understanding. Richard's corruption wasn't a recent development or a response to financial pressure. It was a fundamental character flaw that had been enabled and covered up for decades. The family I thought I knew was a carefully constructed facade, and it was crumbling around me. That night I found grandfather in his study looking through old photo albums. I spoke with Diana today, I said, gently sitting beside him. He looked up, surprise and something like shame crossing his face. Diana, I haven't heard from her in over 20 years. She had some interesting things to say about Dad, about patterns that started long ago. Grandfather closed the album, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't want to believe it back then. Richard was my son, my heir. Diana was always difficult, independent. It was easier to believe her jealous than to face the truth about Richard. And now I'm an old man with too many regrets and too little time to make things right. He looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time. You have your mother's strength, Aubrey, and her integrity. Don't let Richard destroy that. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone lit up with an incoming call from the family lawyer. Richard had escalated his legal attack, filing an emergency petition to have grandfather declared mentally incompetent, with himself named as guardian of both grandfather and the estate. The family war had just entered a new and dangerous phase, and I realized with a sinking feeling that we were far from prepared for what was coming. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Diana's lakeside cottage, casting long shadows across her living room floor. Located 2 hours from the family estate, the modest house offered a perfect sanctuary for strategic planning away from prying eyes and potential bugs that might have been planted at grandfather's home. We need to stop playing defense, I said, pacing the length of the room. Richard has been 3 steps ahead this whole time because he knows how we think. It's time we surprise him. Gathered around the wooden coffee table were the people I now considered my war counsel, Diana, whose insider knowledge of family history provided crucial context. Stephanie, whose financial expertise had already uncovered multiple hidden accounts. Jason Holt, whose decades of legal experience gave our efforts legitimacy. And Sarah Delgado, the forensic accountant whose meticulous work was building an unassailable case. Aubrey's right, Diana, said, her Mitchell blue eyes, so like my own, shining with determination. Richard exploits people's predictability. He's counting on us to follow conventional legal channels, which gives him time to hide assets and build his counterclaims. We need to think like Richard, Sarah suggested, opening her laptop. If I were him, I'd be moving money around right now, creating new shells, possibly even planning to leave the country. Can we freeze his assets? I asked Jason. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, a habit when he was thinking carefully. With the evidence we've gathered, yes. I can file for an emergency injunction as early as tomorrow. That's our first move then, I decided. Cut off his financial mobility. Stephanie looked up from her tablet. We should also consider bringing in someone who specializes in finding people who don't want to be found. If Richard gets wind of the asset freeze, he might run. Diana nodded, reaching for her phone. I know someone. Marcus Webb. Ex-military, now a private investigator who specializes in fraud cases. He's discreet and thorough. Over the next 3 days, I absorbed everything I could from our team of experts. Jason taught me about legal loopholes and how to anticipate Richard's countermoves. Sarah walked me through complex financial tracking systems, showing me how to follow money trails through shell companies and offshore accounts. Marcus webbed Diana's PI contact, a man with silver hair and unnervingly observant eyes, instructed me on the psychology of fraudsters. They follow patterns, Marcus explained, spreading surveillance photos across the table. Your father visits the same restaurants, the same tailor, the same mistress every Thursday afternoon. I looked up sharply. Mistress, Marcus nodded. Cynthia isn't the only woman in his life, and that gives us leverage. Meanwhile, Diana worked her old family connections, quietly gathering information on Richard's current business dealings and social circles. Richard has been systematically bleeding other family trusts, she reported, after a series of discreet phone calls. 3 cousins on the West Coast, an uncle in Chicago, all with similar stories. He positioned himself as the financial guru of the family, offering to manage their inheritances. So I wasn't special, I said with a bitter laugh. Just another mark. Don't underestimate how personal this is, Diana warned. You're the daughter of the woman who saw through him before anyone else did. Your mother was planning to expose Richard's early schemes before her accident. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Our first major countermove came when grandfather, following Jason's counsel, formally transferred trustee rights from Richard to Diana for all remaining family trusts. While the bulk of my trust fund was gone, this legal maneuver prevented Richard from accessing any other family funds. Richard's reaction was swift and predictable. Within 48 hours, his legal team filed an emergency petition claiming grandfather was being manipulated and lacked the mental capacity to make financial decisions. This is actually good for us, Jason explained as we prepared for the hearing. He's walking into a trap. Harold has undergone 3 separate cognitive assessments in the past month, all confirming his mental acuity. Richard is overplaying his hand. The family court hearing was set for a rainy Tuesday morning. I arrived early with grandfather, who insisted on attending despite my concerns about his health. Diana, Stephanie, and our legal team occupied one side of the courtroom. Richard, Cynthia, and their attorneys sat opposite with Tyler, conspicuously absent. Richard barely glanced in my direction, but Cynthia shot me a venomous look before composing her features into an expression of concerned sympathy, no doubt practiced for the judge's benefit. Richard's attorney presented his case, first painting a picture of a devoted son, concerned about his elderly father's sudden, irrational decisions under the influence of an estranged granddaughter with financial motives. Mr. Mitchell Sr. has a documented heart condition that can affect cognitive function, the lawyer argued smoothly. We have statements from family, friends, noting changes in his behavior. When it was our turn, Jason approached the bench with calm confidence. Your Honor, we have medical reports from 3 separate specialists confirming Mr. Mitchell's cognitive health. He submitted the documents, then turned to me. Additionally, Miss, Mitchell's nursing background makes her particularly qualified to recognize any signs of diminished capacity. I took the stand drawing on both my professional knowledge and personal connection as I testified about grandfather's mental state. As a registered nurse who specializes in geriatric care, I can confirm that while my grandfather has physical health challenges, his cognitive function is completely intact. His memory, reasoning, and judgment are excellent. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, studied the medical reports carefully before looking up at Richard. Mr. Mitchell, these assessments directly contradict your claims. Do you have medical evidence to present? Richard's attorney scrambled, offering only statements from concerned family friends, most likely paid off, and pointing to grandfather's recent erratic financial decisions. Protecting one's assets from theft is hardly erratic, the judge observed dryly. By the hearing's end, Richard's petition was dismissed, and we secured a temporary order preventing him from contacting grandfather or entering the family estate. It was our first clear victory, but Richard's furious expression as he stormed out of the courtroom told me this battle was far from over. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Derek Coleman, Richard's longtime business partner, contacted Jason after learning about the legal proceedings. Derek wants to talk, Jason informed me during a secure call. He's worried about criminal exposure and is offering information in exchange for immunity. The meeting took place at Jason's office with Marcus Webb inconspicuously positioned to ensure Derek wasn't followed. Derek looked nothing like the confident businessman I remembered from years ago. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and dark circles underlined his bloodshot eyes. Richard's coming apart, Derek confessed, hands shaking slightly as he accepted a coffee. The Taiwan deal collapsed last month. 20 million in investor funds gone. He's been frantically moving money around liquidating assets. He knows it's all coming down. Why come to us now? I asked, skeptical of his sudden attack of conscience. Because he's setting me up to take the fall, Derek said bitterly. I found documents in our shared server, forgeries with my signature on transactions I never approved. In exchange for limited immunity, Derek provided complete electronic records of the business operations, including emails where Richard explicitly discussed hiding trust assets and creating false investment losses. Meanwhile, Stephanie discovered a hidden pattern in Cynthia's communications. She's been feeding information to someone about your daily schedule security arrangements at the estate, everything Stephanie reported showing me the analysis of phone records. Just as our case was building momentum, Richard launched a sophisticated PR campaign. Articles began appearing in business publications and local papers, questioning my motives and character. Former nursing colleagues received anonymous calls suggesting I had substance abuse issues or had mishandled medications. The hospital administration called me in for questioning, though they ultimately found no evidence of wrongdoing. Still, the damage to my professional reputation was done. I was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Richard was attacking my livelihood, my character, and my future, just as he had stolen my past. When I felt closest to giving up, Stephanie made a crucial discovery hidden in old family records. Documents that not only proved Richard's long pattern of fraud, but suggested a disturbing connection to my mother's fatal accident. Years ago, the game had changed. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about justice, and possibly even something darker that had been buried for over 20 years. The call came at 3:17 a.m., jolting me from a fitful sleep. Grandfather's night nurse, her voice tight with controlled urgency, said only, "You need to come now." I drove through empty streets to the hospital, streetlights blurring through my windshield as I blinked back tears and focused on the road. Please let him be okay. I prayed silently, though, to what or whom I wasn't sure. My family had never been religious. The cardiac care unit was eerily quiet, except for the persistent beeping of monitors. Grandfather lay pale against white sheets, oxygen tubes in his nostrils, an IV dripping fluids into his arm. He looked smaller, somehow diminished. The doctor's words washed over me in waves. Significant cardiac event critical but stable next 24 hours crucial. I sank into the chair beside his bed, taking his papery hand in mine. His fingers twitched slightly at my touch, but his eyes remained closed. "I'm here, Grandpa," I whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." Dawn was breaking when Stephanie arrived with coffee and a change of clothes for me. Diana followed shortly after, her face drawn with worry. We formed a vigil in the small room, speaking in hushed tones about test results and treatment options. The last person I expected to see was my father. Yet there he was in the doorway around noon, Cynthia hovering behind him like a designer-clad shadow. He'd somehow charmed his way past the nurse's station despite the restraining order. "How is he?" Richard asked, his voice carrying just the right note of concern. Ever the performer. "You need to leave," I said, standing to block his view of Grandfather. "There's a court order." "That's for the estate, not the hospital," Richard countered smoothly. "He's my father, Aubrey. Whatever our differences, I have a right to be here." Before I could argue further, a nurse appeared to check Grandfather's vitals, and a hospital administrator was summoned to mediate the family dispute. In the confusion, I missed seeing Cynthia slip away from the group. Richard maintained his concerned son act flawlessly, speaking knowledgeably about grandfather's medical history to the attending physician. Even Diana seemed momentarily taken in by his apparent sincerity. "Perhaps we've been too harsh," she whispered to me as we watched Richard speaking with the doctor. "People can change when faced with mortality." I knew better. This was another performance, another manipulation. But even I couldn't have predicted how Richard would use this moment to his advantage. While our attention was focused on grandfather, Richard's legal team was filing emergency motions in 3 separate courts. By the time I received a call from Jason that evening, the damage was done. "They've frozen everything," Jason explained, his voice tense with suppressed anger. "All family assets, including the funds we set aside for legal expenses pending investigation of what they're calling disputed claims. Richard is alleging mismanagement by Diana as the new trustee." "How is that possible?" I asked, stepping into the hospital hallway for privacy. "Diana's only been trustee for a few weeks." "It's a legal maneuver designed to buy time and cut off our resources," Jason explained. "They're claiming the transfer of trustee rights itself was improperly executed due to Harold's health concerns. It's thin, but it will take time to fight." With grandfather unable to speak for himself and our financial resources suddenly cut off our momentum ground to a halt, Richard had effectively leveraged his father's heart attack to gain tactical advantage. The following day brought another blow. As I was leaving the hospital to shower and change clothes, Cynthia approached me in the parking garage, her stiletto heels echoing against concrete. "Such a difficult time," she said with manufactured sympathy. "Family should come together during crises, don't you think?" "What do you want, Cynthia?" I asked. Too exhausted for games. To offer a solution. She opened her designer purse, removing a document. A settlement agreement. "Richard is prepared to acknowledge certain oversights in managing your trust. There would be a payment of $500,000, and all this ugliness could end." $500,000 out of $3.4 million? That's insulting. Cynthia's artificial smile didn't waver. "It's generous considering the alternative. Your grandfather needs peace, Aubrey. Not a legal battle that could drag on for years. Tell Richard he can keep his blood money. We'll see him in court." I turned to leave, but Cynthia's next words stopped me cold. "That's unfortunate. Especially for Stephanie." I turned slowly. "What does Stephanie have to do with this?" "Did your cousin never mention that she worked for one of Richard's companies? Just for a summer 3 years ago. Long enough to have signed certain documents. Documents that could suggest complicity in financial irregularities." My mind raced. Stephanie had never mentioned this connection. "You're bluffing," I said, but uncertainty had crept into my voice. Cynthia merely smiled, sliding back into her car. "Ask her about Project Centurion. Then decide if you want to take our offer." When confronted, Stephanie broke down in tears, confirming she had indeed briefly worked for one of Richard's subsidiaries after college. "It was just a summer job while I was figuring out my career path," she explained, her voice cracking. "I was an administrative assistant. I signed whatever was put in front of me. I didn't know." "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, feeling betrayed all over again. "I was afraid you wouldn't trust me. That you'd think I was like them." She showed me copies of documents bearing her signature authorizing transfers between accounts. "Richard can make it look like I was involved. He has everything he needs to discredit me as a witness." With Stephanie compromised, our financial expert effectively neutralized, Richard moved to the next phase of his counterattack. News articles began appearing questioning the validity of our claims. A prominent business journal published a profile of Richard portraying him as a successful entrepreneur being targeted by resentful family members. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from distant relatives and family friends, some expressing concern, others outright accusing me of causing grandfather's heart attack with my vendetta. The narrative was shifting. Rather than a victim seeking justice, I was being painted as a greedy, ungrateful heiress, attacking a respected businessman and devoted son during a family health crisis. Even my professional reputation came under fire. Anonymous reviews appeared on medical rating websites, suggesting I had been disciplined for medication errors. My supervisor called to inform me that the hospital had received inquiries from a reporter investigating ethical concerns about my nursing practice. Isolated, outgunned, and running out of resources, I sat alone in the hospital cafeteria late one night, considering Cynthia's settlement offer. $500,000 was a fraction of what had been stolen, but it would let me start over somewhere new away from the toxic Mitchell family legacy. As I stirred my cold coffee, Diana found me. She took one look at my face and sat down across from me. "You're thinking about taking their offer," she stated flatly. I couldn't meet her eyes. "Maybe it's the only way to end this." "That's exactly what Richard wants you to believe. That you're alone, that you're beaten." She reached across the table, her hand covering mine. "But you're a Mitchell Aubrey, a real one, and we don't surrender to bullies and thieves." "What choice do I have? Grandfather is incapacitated, our assets are frozen. Stephanie is compromised, and my professional reputation is being systematically destroyed." Diana's eyes, so much like my own, like grandfather's, held a steely determination I envied. "We retreat, regroup, and find another way," she said simply. "This isn't over unless you decide it is." Later that night, sitting beside grandfather's hospital bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, I made my decision. I wouldn't be taking Richard's insulting offer. I would find another path to justice even if I had to forge it myself. What I didn't yet know was that the key to that path lay in a place I'd avoided for years. My mother's old cottage by the lake, where memories and secrets had been gathering dust for over 2 decades. Rain pelted the windshield as I drove along the winding lakeside road wipers, struggling to keep pace. It had been 11 years since I'd last visited my mother's cottage, a small A-frame structure nestled among pine trees overlooking Lake Mitchell, named after my ancestors who had settled the area generations ago. The property had remained empty all these years, maintained minimally by a caretaker service grandfather paid for. I'd avoided it, finding the memories of summer days with my mother before her death too painful to revisit. Now I was drawn back by necessity rather than nostalgia. The cottage appeared through the rain-soaked trees, weathered but standing firm against the elements. The key was exactly where it had always been, hidden in a false rock in the garden. Some things, at least, remained unchanged. Musty air greeted me as I pushed open the door. Furniture draped with white sheets loomed like ghosts in the dim light. I flipped switches, relieved when the electricity responded. The caretakers had at least kept the utilities connected. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. Diana had suggested that if my mother had been planning to expose Richard's early schemes, as we now suspected, she might have kept evidence somewhere safe. The cottage, which had been solely her property, inherited from her own grandmother, seemed the most likely place. For hours I searched, methodically checking bookshelves, closets, floorboards, and crawl spaces. Nothing. Exhausted, I collapsed onto the sheet-covered sofa, raising a small cloud of dust. My gaze drifted to the stone fireplace centerpiece of the small living room. Above it hung a portrait of my mother, young, vibrant, smiling. Something about the angle of the frame caught my attention. It hung slightly askew, but not from the top, as would be natural if it had simply slipped over time. The bottom right corner protruded farther from the wall than the rest. Standing on the hearth, I carefully removed the portrait. Behind it was a small wall safe I'd never known existed. My heart pounded as I stared at the combination lock. What would my mother have used as a code? After several failed attempts using her birthday, my birthday, and her anniversary, I tried the day she had met my father. A date she had always claimed was the beginning of her real life. The lock clicked open. Inside was a weathered cardboard box containing journals, letters, and a USB drive that looked surprisingly modern compared to the other items. I began with the journals, my mother's familiar handwriting bringing tears to my eyes. The entries started innocuously recording daily life and her early happiness with Richard. But around the time I was 5, the tone changed. R took money from his father again today. Claims it's a loan but never documents it. When I questioned him, he became defensive. Something isn't right with the family finances. I need to look deeper. Later entries detailed growing suspicions, secret investigations, and finally damning evidence. Found proof today that R has been siphoning money from family trusts. Not just Harold's accounts, but cousins, aunts, anyone who trusted him with their finances. He's created an elaborate shell game. When confronted, he first denied, then justified his actions as protecting the family assets. Threatened me when I suggested coming clean to Harold. I'm afraid for the first time in our marriage. The final journal entry sent a chill through me. Dated 3 days before her fatal car accident, it read, "Meeting with Harold's lawyer tomorrow. Have organized all evidence. R suspects something. Came home early, found me in his office. Terrible fight. Concerned about A's safety if anything happens to me. Taking precautions. Left backup documentation with J in case of emergency." J. Could that be Jason Holt, the family attorney, had he known all along? The letters corroborated the journal entries, including correspondence with a private investigator she had hired. The USB drive contained scanned financial documents, bank records, and a video file labeled insurance. I plugged the drive into my laptop with trembling hands. The video showed my mother sitting in this very room looking directly into the camera. "If you're watching this, something has happened to me," she began. "Everything I've documented about Richard's financial crimes is true. I have evidence dating back to his first embezzlement from Harold's accounts when he was just 22. She detailed years of systematic fraud, naming accomplices, methods, and amounts. Then she spoke directly to whoever might be watching. "I fear Richard may try to harm me if he discovers how much I know. If anything happens to me, please make sure Aubrey is protected from him. He sees her as an extension of me, and his resentment is growing. The accident on the boat last summer wasn't an accident. I believe he deliberately loosened the railing where he knew I would be standing. I can't prove it, but I know my husband. Please protect my daughter." The video ended, leaving me in stunned silence. The rain continued to drum against the roof, but I barely heard it over the blood pounding in my ears. My father hadn't just stolen my inheritance. There was evidence suggesting he might have been responsible for my mother's death. With shaking hands, I called Diana, who answered on the first ring. "I found something," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "Something big. We need to talk to Jason. Now." Jason Holt arrived at the cottage 2 hours later, soaked from the rain and looking grave. When I confronted him with my mother's final journal entry, he sank into a chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "I wondered if this day would ever come," he said quietly. "Catherine came to me, yes. She had evidence, substantial evidence of Richard's financial crimes. We were preparing to present it to Harold when she conveniently died in a car accident," I finished. Jason nodded slowly. "The brakes failed on a mountain road. The official report called it a tragic accident, but Catherine had mentioned concerns about the car being tampered with previously. I didn't have enough evidence to challenge the finding. But you suspected Richard was involved." "I did. But suspicion isn't proof, Aubrey. After Catherine died, Richard moved quickly to consolidate control over family finances. He convinced Harold that managing the money himself would be too painful a reminder of Catherine. Your grandfather was grief-stricken, barely functioning. It was the perfect opportunity. And you said nothing all these years. I couldn't keep the accusation from my voice. I tried to protect you the only way I could, by ensuring your trust was legally ironclad. I never imagined Richard would be bold enough to simply drain it despite the documentation." He looked down at his hands. "Perhaps I should have done more, but without proof." "Well, now we have proof," I said, gesturing to the evidence spread across the table. "Not just about the financial crimes, but about my mother's suspicions regarding her own death." "This changes everything," Jason agreed. "But we need to be strategic about how we use it. Richard is cornered, and that makes him dangerous." We spent the night developing a new plan. By morning, I had a clear path forward and new determination. This was no longer just about recovering stolen money. It was about justice for my mother and protection for my grandfather. My first call was to Richard's former secretary, Jackie Reynolds, who had retired 5 years earlier. Using information from my mother's files, I was able to convince her that I knew about her unwitting role in the schemes. Rather than being defensive, she was relieved to unburden herself. "I've carried this guilt for years," she confessed. "I typed those letters redirecting trust fund payments. Richard said it was all approved, that you had agreed to reinvest the money. I had my doubts, but I was a single mother. I needed that job." Jackie agreed to provide a sworn statement detailing specific instructions she had received from Richard to hide information about the trust from me. She also confirmed that she had been asked to backdate documents after my mother's death. Next, I arranged for grandfather to record a video deposition from his hospital bed. Though still weak, his mind remained sharp, and his anger gave him strength. He detailed decades of Richard's manipulations, providing context that connected my mother's evidence to current events. Meanwhile, Diana set up an anonymous whistleblower website where others defrauded by Richard could share their stories. Within days, we had testimonies from business partners, distant family members, and former employees. The final piece fell into place when Derek Coleman provided complete electronic records in exchange for a more favorable settlement. These records included emails between Richard and Tyler plotting how to hide financial transactions and discussions about handling me if I became problematic. Most damning of all was a recorded conversation Diana managed to obtain. Using skills from her years investigating Richard, she had equipped Cynthia's hairstylist with a recording device before a regular appointment. On the recording, Cynthia could be heard clearly complaining about Richard's financial problems and explicitly admitting knowledge of the trust fund theft. "He should have just told the girl there was never any money," Cynthia said, unaware she was being recorded. "Instead, he kept up this charade about investments. Now we're stuck dealing with the consequences." With our arsenal of evidence assembled, I felt ready to force a confrontation. But one final discovery changed my approach entirely. While analyzing the electronic records from Derek Stephanie, discovered that Tyler had been siphoning money from Richard's accounts for over a year. Richard's son-in-law was stealing from the thief himself, creating a secondary layer of fraud that Richard remained unaware of. This wasn't just leverage. It was the perfect wedge to drive between the conspirators. People like Richard and Cynthia only remained loyal when it served their interests. If I could turn them against each other, their unified front would crumble. With renewed confidence, I prepared for the final confrontation. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in weeks, sunlight broke through the clouds as I drove away from my mother's cottage. It felt like an omen, or perhaps just my mother's approval of the path I'd chosen. Justice was finally within reach. The Mitchell family estate had witnessed countless gatherings over generations. Weddings, funerals, holiday celebrations, business meetings. Today it would host what might be its most consequential event, a reckoning. Grandfather had been released from the hospital 2 days earlier, still frail but adamant about facing Richard in his own home. He sat in his favorite leather chair in the grand living room, Diana standing protectively beside him. Stephanie managed the audiovisual setup for our evidence presentation while Jason arranged legal documents on the antique coffee table. Sarah Delgado had prepared comprehensive financial analysis, and Marcus Webb had positioned himself discreetly near the entrance both as security and to prevent anyone from leaving prematurely. I stood by the large bay windows watching the driveway for arrivals. Richard and Cynthia arrived precisely at the agreed time, Tyler trailing behind them. They entered with the confidence of people who believed they still held the upper hand. Richard had brought his lawyer, a sharp-featured man with cold eyes, who carried a briefcase that likely contained settlement offers designed to silence us. "I see you've assembled quite the gathering," Richard remarked, his tone falsely casual as he took in the group. "Though I'm not sure what you hope to accomplish that our lawyers couldn't handle privately." "Sit down," Richard grandfather said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "You too, Cynthia. Tyler, Once everyone was seated, I stepped forward. We invited you here to give you one final opportunity to make this right before we proceed with both criminal and civil actions. Richard's lawyer started to object, but Richard silenced him with a gesture. More empty threats, Aubrey. Your legal options are limited, as you well know. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to ongoing fraud, Jason interjected smoothly, nor to certain other criminal activities we've uncovered. I nodded to Stephanie, who activated the projector. The first image to appear was my mother's face, a still from the video she had recorded before her death. Richard's confident expression faltered momentarily. "We found Mom's records, Dad," I said quietly. "All of them, including her suspicions about her accident." For the next 30 minutes, we methodically presented our evidence. Financial records, witness statements, recorded conversations, and expert analysis. With each new revelation, Richard's facade cracked further. Cynthia grew increasingly agitated, shooting accusatory glances at her husband. Tyler stared at his shoes, his leg bouncing nervously. When we played the recording of Cynthia discussing the trust fund theft with her hairstylist, Richard turned on her. "You discussed this in public," he hissed. "I didn't know she was recording me," Cynthia shot back, her composure finally breaking. "Besides, you told me it was all legal, just aggressive management of family assets." And you believed that. Richard scoffed. "I thought you were smarter." Their unified front was already crumbling, exactly as planned. The final blow came when Stephanie presented evidence of Tyler's separate embezzlement scheme. "Tyler has been skimming from your accounts for over a year," Stephanie explained, displaying bank transfers on the screen. "Nearly $700,000 moved to offshore accounts under his control." Richard's face darkened with fury as he turned to his stepson. "You ungrateful little—" "You were going down anyway," Tyler blurted out. "I was just securing my future." The room erupted in accusations and denials. Richard's lawyer struggled unsuccessfully to restore order as his clients turned on each other. I let the chaos continue for a few minutes before speaking again, my voice cutting through the noise. "Here's what happens next." The room fell silent as I outlined our terms. Full cooperation with authorities, complete financial disclosure, and transfer of all remaining assets to a court-appointed receiver. In exchange, we would recommend leniency in sentencing and would not actively pursue charges related to my mother's death due to the difficulty of proving culpability after so many years. "If you refuse these terms," I concluded, "we release everything to the district attorney, the FBI, Financial Crimes Unit, and the media simultaneously. By this time tomorrow, the Mitchell name will be synonymous with fraud, and all three of you will likely face jail time." Richard's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Richard seemed beyond rational thought. "You wouldn't dare destroy the family name. You're bluffing." "The Mitchell name stands for integrity," Grandfather said firmly. "You're the one who's tarnished it, Richard. Aubrey is trying to restore it." "This is ridiculous," Richard snapped, standing abruptly. "I don't have to listen to this. Come on, Cynthia." But Cynthia didn't move. She was staring at the settlement papers, a calculating look in her eyes. "How much immunity would I get if I cooperated fully?" she asked Jason, ignoring Richard's look of betrayal. "Cynthia," Richard hissed. "I'm not going to prison for you, Richard," she said coldly. "I knew you were manipulating family finances, yes, but I had no idea about Catherine's suspicions or the extent of your fraud." Richard's face contorted with rage. "After everything I've given you, the houses, the jewelry, the lifestyle, given me—" Cynthia laughed bitterly. "You mean given me with stolen money? Money that can be traced directly to me as an accomplice? No, thank you." Seeing his wife turn against him seemed to finally break something in Richard. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked suddenly older, smaller. "It was never supposed to go this far," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Just a little financial maneuvering at first. Then it grew." "And Mom," I asked, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "Was that financial maneuvering too?" Richard looked up, something like genuine remorse flickering across his face. "Catherine's death was an accident. I swear it." Yes, she suspected my financial activities and threatened to expose me, but I couldn't have. Whether he was telling the truth or not, I might never know with certainty. But his crumbling demeanor suggested that whatever else he was guilty of, he might be innocent of that ultimate crime. The resolution proceeded with surprising speed after that. Richard, seeing both his wife and stepson ready to testify against him, finally understood the futility of further resistance. His lawyer negotiated terms of cooperation, and by evening preliminary agreements had been signed. Criminal charges would still be filed, but with recommendations for reduced sentences in exchange for full disclosure and asset recovery. Forensic accountants would trace the money trail to recover what could be found. The family name would suffer, but the public narrative would emphasize the actions taken to right the wrongs. 1 year later, I stood on the porch of my newly purchased home, my mother's childhood residence, which I had been able to buy back with a portion of the recovered trust funds. Significant amounts had indeed been recovered once Richard, Cynthia, and Tyler began competing to demonstrate cooperation. Offshore accounts were revealed, hidden assets, liquidated luxury items surrendered for auction. Grandfather's health had improved once the stress of family betrayal was resolved. He now spent his days working with Diana to restructure family governance, ensuring no single person could ever again control Mitchell resources without proper oversight. Stephanie had become the financial guardian for grandfather's estate, her expertise and loyalty proven beyond doubt during the ordeal. Uncle Robert had entered treatment for gambling addiction and was slowly rebuilding relationships with family members. Richard, Cynthia, and Tyler had all received various sentences. Richard the most severe at 12 years for fraud, embezzlement, and financial crimes spanning decades. I had visited him once in prison, not for reconciliation, but for closure. The man who sat across from me in a prison jumpsuit was a stranger, and I realized I had never really known my father at all. The nursing scholarship I established with part of my recovered trust fund had already helped 5 promising students. I had returned to work part-time at the hospital while also developing financial literacy workshops for young healthcare professionals, teaching them to protect themselves from the kind of exploitation I had experienced. On a warm spring afternoon, I hosted a small gathering at my new home. Grandfather sat in a rocking chair on the porch, Diana beside him. Stephanie arrived with homemade desserts, and Jason brought a bottle of champagne. Even Aunt Patricia came, her relationship with the family slowly mending. As we shared a meal together on the wide porch overlooking the garden my mother had once loved, Grandfather raised his glass. "To Catherine," he said simply, "who tried to protect this family long before any of us understood it needed protecting." Later, as the gathering was winding down, I walked to the small cemetery on the property where my mother was buried. I placed fresh flowers on her grave, the weight of unresolved questions finally lifted from my shoulders. I had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in trust funds or bank accounts. It was found in bonds of trust and integrity and standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible, in rebuilding what had been broken. My mother's final journal entry had been a question: how did money corrupt our family so completely? Now I had an answer to leave in its place. It hadn't. Not completely. Not irreparably. Because here we were, healing, rebuilding, finding our way back to what mattered. The Mitchell family would go on changed, but stronger. And I would go forward no longer defined by what had been stolen from me, but by what I had reclaimed. Not just financially, but in spirit, in truth, in purpose. That I realized was the most valuable inheritance of all. I hope my story has given you some courage if you've ever faced betrayal or injustice in your own family. The road to healing isn't easy, but it's worth traveling. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything? How did you handle it? Drop a comment below and share your experience. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of family healing and finding strength in difficult times. Remember to share this with someone who might need to hear that justice is possible even when it seems out of reach. Thank you for listening to my journey. Remember, sometimes the darkest family secrets, when finally brought to light, can lead to the brightest new beginnings. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.